The University of Johannesburg has issued an unconditional apology for the behaviour of its security personnel. Vice-Chancellor Aaron Rensburg says the institution's guards went too far when they attacked journalists and protesting students on Wednesday night. To discuss this further, I'm joined via Skype by Professor Jane Duncan. She's from UJ's journalism department, and she herself, we understand, was caught up with an altercation with security at UJ this week. Good morning to you, Professor. Firstly, tell us about your experience when violence hit UJ this week.
Good morning. Well, I was, together with several academics, were called to the scene of protest in order to act as protest monitors, which what we've done in the past in order to just get a sense of how the protest is unfolding and to document any cases of human rights abuses taking place in the protests. I had an altercation with members of the Tactical Response Unit of the Hillbrow Police Station because I attempted to take a photograph of them on their vehicle. And they maintained that I didn't have a right to do, they maintained I didn't have a right to do, and I set them straight on that particular issue and reminded them of their own standing order. The reason why I took the photograph is because I was particularly concerned to see the presence of a paramilitary unit on our campus. Paramilitary units are trained for maximum force rather than minimum force, which is what the public order police are generally trained to do. I think we're aware of the fact from the Farlam Commission of Inquiry that the paramilitary units, and specifically the Tactical Response Team and the National Intervention Unit, were responsible for the Marikana massacre because a decision was taken for the operation to go tactical too soon. It concerns me greatly, and I've raised it, in fact, in the internal structures of the university, to see one of those very units sitting on our campus on a day where the protests were largely peaceful. I think that that is a recipe for disaster.
Professor Duncan, one of the questions that you've dealt with extensively is over whether South Africa is reverting to a repressive state. Given your reading of how the police have been responding to the current protest by students, what would your take be?
Well, I think that there's been an over-policing of the student protests, and that has radicalized the protests hugely. We need to see these protests as being part of a protest cycle, and we need to understand the chain of cause and effect that have taken place in this cycle from last year. Last year, the protests were largely peaceful, and there was a climate of negotiation, I think, and tolerance of divergent ideological views. We saw, I think, a fairly intolerant response on the part of universities and the police to these protests. Universities sought wide-ranging interdicts that prohibited protests that were merely disruptive. Bear in mind, the protest action by its very nature is disruptive. And in fact, the Regulation of Gatherings Act only starts to become concerned about protests when there's serious disruption. So we saw wide-ranging, broad interdicts being instituted, which ultimately led to this over-policing because the police obviously have to enforce these interdicts. We also saw the deployment of private security guards on campus. Now, private security guards aren't subject to the same levels of accountability as the public police. And we've seen many cases of private security violence against the students. Now, what does this do? It radicalizes protest action. It scares off the more moderate members of protests, the kind of people who you would want to see remaining in the protests because they may actually talk the hotheads out of engaging in more extreme actions. And the people who are left are the people who are committed to engaging in more extreme actions, including extreme disruption and possibly even violence. So, what we've seen the world over is that protest movements often start out peacefully, but become violent in response to the state closure of democratic space and police violence. And this may well lead to small groups organizing themselves, going underground and engaging in increasingly organized acts of violence. I hope that in our case, in universities, this kind of cycle that we've seen unfolding elsewhere doesn't become our own self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I mean, do you think that there's a way that protesters carry out their action which delegitimizes the cause for which we're fighting? You know, of course, on the issue of the current fees protest, public opinion seems split on whether, you know, the burning of institutions and, you know, the damage to property that we've seen, whether or not that is warranted, although people understand the cause for which students are fighting here.
These kinds of actions really cannot be condoned, but I think we also need to move beyond pure condemnation, and we also need to understand as well, because unless we understand why we've come to this particular point, we're not going to be able to address the underlying factors that have given rise to this violence. And I think that is where we need to be framing this particular public discussion. Unfortunately, all too often in the public debate, there's a focus on the end point, the burning of the auditorium or the burning of the library, without necessarily asking the question, how did we get to this point? Unfortunately, and I've seen this in a lot of my research in relation to protest action in the broader world outside our campuses, protests become radicalized, and some protesters engage in violence because non-violent, peaceful and non-disruptive forms of protest are ignored. And in fact, we can see, you know, a long cycle unfolding in many of the protests in our country, where people attempt to engage the authorities in a meaningful, constructive kind of way. Either they are rebuffed or they are ignored. They then take to the streets peacefully in an attempt to raise their grievances through protest action, and often the authorities respond very badly. They may curtail protest action on grounds that are not recognized by the law or the Constitution. The police may also become intolerant of those particular protests, and that in turn escalates the situation. We need to ask ourselves the question, what has given rise to this particular escalation? And I firmly believe that both university authorities and the state have mishandled the protest right from the start. They have reduced democratic space for peaceful protest, which I think has in turn created space for more violent forms of protest. And these protests have been over-policed. When protests are over-policed, then protesters also become socialized into violence as well. And this creates what a sociologist has called injustice frames around the state. Because if the state behaves in a way that doesn't respect human rights, if the law itself is lawless, then people turn around and say, well, the only thing we can do as our last act of self-defense is to engage in violence ourselves.
All right. Thank you so much for that insight. Professor Jane Duncan, she's with UJ's journalism departments. Your headlines and your sport and weather coming up in a moment. Stay with us.